My name is Zack Lynch, and before I get started on this next panel, I'd like everyone to stand up. I know you ate lunch, and that was a wonderful talk on omega-3s and how it can improve brain function, but another great way to improve brain function is a little bit of exercise. So don't look at me, take a deep breath, stare at the sky, put your hands up, turn around, do the hokey pokey, and sit yourself back down. Take a deep breath. Make sure you get some good oxygen in your blood. It's really important that we stay awake because we've got some fantastic individuals who are going to share their entrepreneurial journeys with us, which I'm very excited to share with you. So this session is around how neurotechnology will change our lives in the coming years. And it's a question I've been thinking about for over literally about 20 years, and from a wide variety of different perspectives. In 2001, I founded Neuro Insights, which is a market research and investment advisory company that began to track all the companies worldwide that were developing treatments for neurological diseases and psychiatric illnesses. So those included pharmaceuticals, biologics, medical devices, diagnostics, software applications, neurofeedback technologies, and begin to bring those under the umbrella of what we were calling the neurotechnology industry. And so we did a couple of things to bring the community together. We launched a monthly investment newsletter to track these companies and their progress from a financing perspective as well as a clinical trial perspective. We started to put on neurotech investing and partnering conferences in San Francisco, in Boston, in Helsinki, and Geneva ultimately. And that allowed us to get really a good insight into sort of what the innovations were coming down the pipeline for treatments to be able to then provide to patients over time. So after doing that for several years, it became apparent to me that there was really a missing public policy component to the emerging brain industry. So I founded the Neurotechnology Industry Organization. And this is a nonprofit trade association that represents now over 120 different neuroscience companies, brain research institutes, and patient advocacy groups that really focuses on how we can accelerate translational neuroscience innovation and do that from a multitude of different perspectives, including a legislative perspective, working with startup companies to try and figure out how they can work with government agencies to improve their effectiveness and their communication with these agencies to work in a more effective fashion. So in doing that, I became fascinated sort of about the impact of neuroscience and neurotechnology on the future of humanity. And so I decided to sit down and write a book. And the book I wrote was The Neuro Revolution. It's about how brain science is changing our world. It ended up being a bestseller, was translated into a whole bunch of languages. In fact, last week I was fortunate enough to give a copy of my Portuguese version to a Brazilian billionaire, and I'm hoping he'll help some of these companies potentially get funded in the years to come. But what my goal there was to really take a 50-year view on how neuroscience was going to impact humanity in a wide variety of ways. And so I looked at it not from a medical perspective, but from a societal perspective. And I took a deep historical view on this. And so I went, okay, there was an agricultural revolution and an industrial revolution. And we're in the midst of an information revolution, where information technologies are driving fundamental political, economic, and social change. And then I asked myself, okay, well, where is humanity going next? And so I started to analyze biotechnology, information technology, cognitive neuroscience, and it became absolutely apparent to me that it really was neuroscience, that we were on the cusp of a neuro revolution that will transform, art, entertainment, law, marketing. Every aspect of our human society over the coming years will be impacted by our understanding of the brain, and it's just getting going. The way I looked at it was basically from 2010 to 2060. So from the perspective of the information technology wave, where we are at in the neurotechnology revolution is basically at the vacuum tube era. The transistor hasn't been built yet. The internet isn't barely conceived. Maybe one or two people are like J.C.R. Licklider who have conceived that maybe there will be some emotional internet of the future. But it really hasn't, the fundamental technologies to sort of underpin that technology haven't emerged yet. And so after writing that book, I had an opportunity to really go talk with some of the leading researchers around the world in neuroeconomics, neuroaesthetics, neuropolicy. And from those conversations, it became absolutely apparent to me that where the world was headed next was the convergence of digital technologies and neuroscience, and how these digital technologies would be informed by advances in neuroscience, and how those would then be used as new treatment regimens, as well as opportunities to improve human performance across a wide variety of endeavors, including health, wellness, learning, training, education, physical and mental acuity. And so with that in mind, I started to bring a whole bunch of researchers and entrepreneurs together in some neurogaming conferences. It was sort of a meme I wanted to put together to sort of bring this community together. And those now have been going on for a couple of years now, and bringing together, you know, nearly 700 or 800 last year, different sort of researchers and entrepreneurs who are in this nexus of merging these technologies to develop new ways to improve the human experience. And it's out of that I've gotten to know these three entrepreneurs, each in a different way. And I'm now excited to sort of share with you their stories and have you get to know their technologies in a way that I hope will give you some insight and hope into sort of where digital technology and neuroscience will be heading in the years to come. So, Jen, would you like to start out for a few minutes? Maybe stand up and share a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Big White Wall.
Thank you. What a brilliant day it's been so far. I think it's revolutionized some of my thinking, what I've heard this morning, but also I think my domestic life. I think when I get back to London on Friday, I'm going to be going to my kids and saying, stop the homework, start gaming. I guess where my journey starts in 2007 when I founded Big White Wall is around the whole issue of access. Previous to that, I'm actually totally unemployable. All I am capable of is setting up organizations. And I'm a serial social entrepreneur and have set up everything from grant-making foundations in the Balkans to master's programs and social development practice in South Africa and so on. But in 2006, and I might tell this story later on, there was a certain event that triggered me into thinking there was a huge financial and social tragedy surrounding mental health, and a lot of it was to do with access. So, you know, just if we assume that everybody in this room is experiencing anxiety or depression, we know that half of you would never get to your primary care doc. And we know that if you did, that half of you would then not get an appropriate diagnosis. And that's costing in the US something like $193 billion a year in lost earnings alone to US employers. And these seem to me like really crazy statistics. And that, for example, if I was really feeling low anytime after 5 o'clock, where do I go? We know from the stats on our service that those people with the highest levels of depression on a PHQ-9 use Big White Wall between midnight and 4 a.m. Where else would you be? What is your alternative? ER, maybe. Well, as we know, that's not a good space to be in if you're experiencing poor mental health. So let me just take you on a very brief journey of what, let's take anything really. Let's take somebody who's just gone to college and for the first time in their life starts experiencing social anxiety. Left home, new environment. What would Big White Wall do for them? Well, effectively, it's an entirely digital service. So through their cell phone or through their laptop, they would hear about this service through their college. They would register, and as they register, we already start learning about them. The whole service is run by, underlies it, what I call the greatest safety net that we have in the world now, which is data. So we start learning about them, and we start getting ready to offer up some things that are really going to help them with their own support and recovery. And those can include everything from engaging in what we first established in 2007, which is an anonymized peer support network, which is clinically facilitated 24/7. And in that support network, people can form their own groups. So we have everything from groups of men and women who've served in combat zones through to people who are survivors of childhood sexual abuse. They can condition track. We have a whole range of instruments where you can track your PHQ-9 for depression, GAD-7 for anxiety, although we don't give them those beautiful names because who the hell calls something like that a PHQ-9? Oh, I must do my PHQ-9 today. So we colloquialize it. We don't use the language of mental health. We don't use medical language, but it's completely underwritten by science, not least in the whole growing body of evidence that utilizing peer-based approaches significantly increases your chances of long-term behavioral health change. In the space, they can also express themselves very creatively. They can create bricks with visual images and post them on the wall and use that as another means of engaging, based very strongly on the work of Dr. Jamie Pennebaker, who's the head of psychology in Austin, Texas. They can anonymously use social networking principles, so form friendships, anonymous friendships, and track one another. They can do courses, perhaps a 6-week course on anxiety based on cognitive behavior therapy, perhaps lifestyle issues that are highly related to their mental health condition, like, this college student can help deal with anxiety, but at the same time, he can follow a course on helping him quit smoking. And then at the top end of Big White Wall, we have a secure Skype-like platform. So let's say for this college student that they actually do need a one-on-one clinician, and they can get a direct video, audio, text conversation with a clinician in real time. Now, one of the things that really marks out the space is that we do staff Big White Wall 24/7. In the US, the service is staffed by master's qualified social workers. And they use technology, proprietary technology, for 2 things. One, to ensure that people are safe, and if they need escalating back into the Kaiser Permanente health system or to the Baylor health system, they can be escalated back into it. But also ensure that people engage, and they break down any kind of isolation somebody experiences and can help them build the kind of social networks that are essential to their development. And actually, I was very interested in the first speaker this morning, because I think that if you're looking, I can't even say the word hypothalamus, is that right? If, the notion of using a social community is also one that builds the hypothalamus. And I've actually posed a tweet question, to which I'm still waiting an answer to see what the actual evidence is around that, but my guess is that it's quite strong. So these clinical facilitators ensure that people are safe, and they ensure that they engage. And it is not just as you enter the Big White Wall system that the data is running. We have developed a lot of data algorithms to help with those things of personalization and risk stratification. So we have got a patent pending, for example, that as soon as you contribute just 20 words of your story, just 20 words of your story, or take part and use 20 words in a course, we can predict your level of depression on a PHQ-9 and your level of anxiety on a GAD-7 with 90% accuracy, which means you never need to do the test, but we can help personalize what's then served up to you, the other people that are like you, the course that might most benefit you, the self-management materials that might be best for you, the tests that you can take and utilize that might be best for you. And it also helps us with the risk stratification. Now, I think that one of the things that's been quite critical to me is ensuring that this service has the same clinical and information governance standards as if you go into a hospital, into a primary care clinic. I think that's an issue we're going to be discussing in the panel, so all I will say is that we have Care Quality Commission registration in the UK, and I was seeking similar in the US, and that's the regulatory body for whole of health and social care, because digital and technology has no excuse not to have the same rigorous standards as mainstream healthcare organizations. And in terms of results, we've had incredible results. We know, for example, in a study that was done last year by a leading mental health, so Kerry Cooper, looking at mental health in work, that we reduced absenteeism due to mental health by 67% and increased productivity at work by 76%. We're endorsed by the National Health Service, and I guess that if I look at what lies at the basis of the success of Big White Wall, it's human-sized technology. It is about using what I call the old age version of population healthcare, which is peer-to-peer support, and wrapping some clever tech around that to ensure people that are supported on their journeys to recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Corey McCann, CEO of Pear Therapeutics.
Absolutely. That's a tough act to follow, and as we were all taking some time and chatting before the panel, I think it became very apparent to this group that we're all approaching the very same set of issues, but in some very different ways. So I guess to give you just a little bit of my personal background, I'm originally trained as a physician neuroscientist, spent a lot of time at the bedside, and then also a lot of time at the bench side, looking at synaptic plasticity, all the way down to the tracking of individual neurotransmitter receptor molecules and trying to understand how cognitive experience and molecules come together to modify and pattern the developing nervous system. Contrast that completely with my most recent post, where I was a biotech investor with a venture capital firm in Boston called MPM Capital, sort of being the sullen business guy in the corner, raining on everyone's parades quarterly. Both of those experiences really come together to form the kernel for what is Pear Therapeutics. And Pear, very simply, is about creating digital therapies which embody the opportunity to recapitulate multimodal care. So again, taking these two levers in the brain, so cognitive experience and neurochemistry, and trying to pull all of this together in a scalable way to bring this all the way through to patients, through to reimbursement, and through to large-scale distribution. I know those are some very lofty ideas, but just to give you some boots on the ground and a boots on the ground sense for how this all comes together. So the company is a venture-backed company. We often joke that we have the exciting people, so the gamers, the content developers, they're all out in San Francisco. And then we have the boring people like myself, so the clinical and regulatory people, they all sit in Boston. And we bring these two groups of people together on a regular basis to really try to take the regulatory high road to the development of digital therapeutics. And when I say the regulatory high road, we develop these digital therapies in much the same way that one would develop a drug. So that for us means randomized clinical studies. That for us means FDA approval. That for us means mountains and mountains of paperwork. But again, the notion is quite simple. It's all about bringing together really the therapies that are best supported by randomized clinical data and scaling them to patients. To give you a sense for how this comes together in a clinical setting, I'll talk a little bit about our lead program. It's a program that's called RESET. And this is a program which is in the queue to become the first FDA-approved digital therapy to treat addiction. So this is a program that's seen about $25 million of government spending. We've got about 1,000 patients worth of randomized clinical data. And we've just pulled together our first FDA submission for approval of this, what is an app. We call it a digital therapy, but what is an app in substance use disorder. And just to give you a very brief sense for the magnitude of the impact that we're seeing and the types of studies that we think about as bearing credence on these types of therapies. So the data package that we just submitted is from a 507-patient multi-center randomized clinical study. Patients were divided into two groups. One group saw face-to-face therapy. The other group saw digital therapy. And abstinence was assessed by twice-weekly urinalysis. So these were not patient surveys as to do you feel like you were sober. These were not timeline follow-back assessments. This is hardest of the hard data to assess sobriety. The study was run for 12 weeks, and at the end of the 12 weeks, lo and behold, what we saw was a roughly doubling of abstinence when one looks at the face-to-face therapy arm versus the digital therapy arm. So as someone who's looked at many, many failed drugs in the CNS space, that's a big honkin' effect size. There are lots of zeros after the decimal point in the p-value, and that's the sort of thing that as both a clinician and an investor, I get really excited about. To dig a bit more deeply, when you look at patients in that study who showed up not abstinent at study start, so again, for most of the folks in this room, you know that that's probably the worst prognostic indicator in all of addiction services. The digital therapy was tenfold more efficacious than face-to-face therapy. So at the end of the study, 2.5% of the patients in the face-to-face therapy arm were abstinent, whereas about 25% of the patients in the digital therapy arm were abstinent. So big numbers, big effect sizes, things which are highly clinically significant. To give you just a very brief sense as to how the same concept plays out around the rest of our portfolio, We have a schizophrenia program with evidence to enhance PANS, which is the aggregate approvable endpoint in schizophrenia when used in combination with atypical antipsychotics. We have a generalized anxiety program in the pipe, a PTSD program, a pain program, and 3 or 4 other programs that sit behind the lead two, again, in addiction and in schizophrenia. So really just to sort of bring this all home, for me, what I get very passionate about, and specifically speaking to this opportunity for technology to better lives and impact health, is thinking about how you bring these types of really remarkable technologies into systems to get them reimbursed and to get them into patients' hands. And so I guess with all of that, if I could, I would knock on wood over there on the table. We're very excited about our FDA submission, very exciting about the opportunity to have the first FDA-approved digital therapy. And at that point, I suspect that we'll be coming back and leaning on many of the folks in this audience in transitioning from evidence to approval to reimbursement to utilization. So with all of that said, look forward to the rest of the conversation here.
Jocelyn Fobet,
Thank you very much.
CSO of Cognizant.
Yes, well, you're certainly setting the pedestal very high, both of you. Be spontaneous here. Like was mentioned, we're very different perspectives on, I assume, similar problems, and then that's human behavior and human performance. So my background, I'm essentially, I'm still a professor. My day job is a professor, okay? So this is a spin-off, a company that I co-founded in 2009, but I'm still working with graduate students in the full lab, you know, very busy with that. And I had a few emergencies to deal with yesterday night, as usual. My background is visual neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience. And essentially I've been for 25 years or so trying to understand how we process information, but particularly how we process what I call dynamic scene information. In other words, how you cross streets, how you drive cars, things like that. And it seems obvious, it's automatic for us, but these are less than automatic processes. I mean, they have evolved through practice, and of course there's predisposition. So what happens when you start aging? You know, normal aging. We're still healthy, we're still okay, our brains are still functioning relatively well, hopefully, thankfully. But things change, and it has an influence on our behavior. It has also an influence on our well-being, because we don't do the things the same way, we don't feel the same confidence. So I was taking, one of the issues I tried to do is to sort of take these principles that I was doing in more basic science, the traditional research perspective, then did a first quantum leap. In 1999, I remember, because I got a large infrastructure grant from the Canadian government. And my justification for that was to build immersive rooms, okay? And of course, my colleagues in the visual domain said, are you crazy? You can't control that. You know, this is too big, it's expensive, and so on and so forth. But my justification was that even if I put all the pieces of the puzzle together and I try to understand what mechanism is responsible for seeing an object, what mechanism is responsible for tracking an object, what mechanism is responsible for interpreting the object, I would never live to see the end of it. And from my perspective, virtual reality at the time, now is a buzzword, but at the time was almost undoable for research in human behavior perspective, I thought was the way to go. And so I justified it that way, and they believed me. So that's where it started. So it started there, and early on, first intentions was to sort of take what the brain does from a perceptual perspective and cognitive perspective when they're dealing with dynamic scenes. What are the fundamental properties that I can isolate there? Because if I can't isolate them and I can't actually interact with them, there's no way I can transfer that, and it's not scalable. Right? So at the time, it was obvious that I had to pose these questions. So I sort of identified a few basic elements, which is nothing new, it's just a recipe. It was the recipe that I thought was necessary to sort of address these systems that I can actually act upon and then hopefully will transfer into real life situations, which has been our focus all the way through. And that's what we call now the NeuroTracker. You see some examples out there. It's scalable now, thank God for all the technology development, and the Oculuses and the Googles and everybody else was working on this and make this, like the next Apple iPhone, of virtual reality, because that's going to make it accessible to everybody else. So essentially, I wanted to make sure that grandma could cross the street without killing herself or killing someone if she's driving. So, and that's not an obvious problem, and it's a performance issue. Performance. So we talked about performance. So this is where the global encapsulating word, if you will, of a lot of the activity of Cognizance and NeuroTracker. So I was interested in the performance of my grandmother, or my mother now, essentially, and the performance of elite athletes, because I also have an interest in athletes. We started working with athletes. Then I got a funny phone call from a funny company or a funny club that's from your neck of the woods called Manchester United. They heard about what we were doing. They were interested in. I'm still embarrassed to say that I did not know who they were at the time. But when I talked to my postdocs who come from Europe, I saw the facial expressions change, so I figured I should call them back. And this sort of got us initiated in what we, sort of the assessment of real-world situation. How can it be used with this group? How efficient can it be, with this population who is at the high end of the performance scale? And then the next question is, how much of an influence will it have on their real performance, what really matters for these people? And that is sort of the approach we've been using now for everything, because the things that we never predicted would be influenced by this behavior, by this approach, by this intervention, things like attention, all of the nice things that were mentioned in the first two talks this morning, and three actually, are so relevant to what we've been doing. How you switch from precise focus, and how you have to, at the same time, have this versatility in your attention and cognitive systems when you're dealing with real-life situations. That's exactly what this little exercise does, and it does it in 5-minute bits. It's like, the power training for the brain. It's very short, very brief, content-free, because that's the whole idea about scalability. Now, if I start, ultimate training of something is doing that activity. So if I'm asking somebody, I want to make you a better basketball player, you play basketball. But they can't play basketball all day. They can't play basketball every day. The load on the injury and on the physical strain, everything else. So you have to find some way to sort of take that content out, because that's not what we want to address, and make sure their brain is rightly set up to actually engage in that content, and make better decisions. This is what we believe we've done with this simple approach. And so far, it's been quite interesting. I think we'll be raising some more questions, so I don't want to ramble on, because I can go on, even though I thought I couldn't live up to you guys.
Thank you.
But that's what it is.
So building on some of the themes that we've been hearing today, at the core of all digital applications and their use by patients is the concept of engagement. And I would love to hear from each one of you, how does your application leverage digital technologies in sort of fundamentally new ways to engage the patient so that whatever you're providing is that much more effective? Corey, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. So, certainly across all of our different digital offerings, we leverage the current digital playbook. So badges, a bit of gamification, push notifications, integration with wearables. Many of these things are, to a certain extent, buzzwords at this point. I think the one thing that we absolutely take to heart is the notion of customization. Having the option for a gamified story layer or not. And I guess just to say a little bit more about that, we're pretty simple people, or I'll speak for myself. I'm a simple person. When I think about why these things work or don't work, generally there's a fairly linear dose-response curve. So if you take CBT, if people do more CBT, they tend to wind up better. If people do less CBT, they tend to wind up, maybe not worse, but less better. And so the gamification lever tends to be a way to get people to play more. And that works for some people, and it doesn't work for other people. And if you sort of take the real world example, some people love jogging and some people love tennis. They're both exercise. One is very heavily gamified and is boring, and the other is boring, and so you sort of flip the script, and different people like different things. So it's a very roundabout way of saying we do everything that we can do to maximize the dose, because what we really care about is the response and the readout on an approvable endpoint.
Right, and so in Reset, you're actually using financial rewards.
Absolutely. So in the addiction space, there is a thing called Contingency Management. And what's been shown over probably the last 25 years is the concept that if you incent for particular behaviors, you enhance outcomes. And so in the context of Reset, we're incenting for 2 behaviors. One is the presentation of a clean urine screen, and the other is completion of one of these CBT modules and answering the proficiency questions on the back end of those modules without error. Those are, for us, really important things for which to incent, because with the module, this really assures that someone didn't just randomly buzz through the questions and input a bunch of garbage and come out with a reward. That's not what we want to incent for. On the notion of incenting for the clean screen, the therapy basically has a mirrored clinician dashboard, and the only way to input a clean screen is for the clinician to input the fact that there was a clean screen. And so by virtue of incenting for the clean screen, it incents for 2 behaviors. Number 1, the fact that you didn't use drugs, which is a good thing. And number 2, the fact that you spoke to your clinician about it and had a conversation about the fact that you didn't use drugs. Both of those things are good things, and so we incent those core behaviors.
And those incentives are on the order of $5 to $25?
Yeah.
Amazon rewards?
So we've done a fully digital contingency management system. We know that the idea of contingency management is not without controversy. There are lots of facilities that are out there that have prize cabinets. Some have fish bowls. Basically, everyone does it in different ways. We are the first digital contingency management system. This all runs through an Amazon gift card and a digital payment. And these are relatively nominal incentives, so on the order of $5 to $20 per user per month. But at the same time, when compounded through a variable reward schedule, these are amounts that really do bend the curve when it comes to abstinence.
Very interesting. Great use of technology. Jen, your website. How do you get us to stay involved?
Let me just not talk about specific technologies, but sure. I think it's about starting with what are the design principles for engagement, because to get decent engagement, you need to think about what principles is your service designed around. So Big White Wall began with a conversation between people with lived experience and mental health professionals about, at that time, we didn't call it design principles. We said, what sort of culture do we want to create in this space? That means you would use it, or I would use it. And I'd say a big part of the emphasis of our whole evolution is about being co-creation with our community. So everything that's been new, that's been developed on the surface, has been done through a principle of co-creation. So there's one design principle. Another is visibility. So we use technology to ensure that when you come into a space, if you contribute, or even if you don't contribute, you're so-called lurking. I have to say lurkers are some of our most active users. They're readers, they're engaging, they're actually finding their own route to support and recovery. But how can you become visible? And we use technology to ensure that people, if they post and there's not a peer response, for example, they will get one of our 24/7 staff will be going in and acknowledging their content. And there's a lot of sort of, tech, I'm not a technologist, I was just about to say tech stuff, which is terrible, isn't it, as I run a technology company. There's a lot of things, lots of like cogs and wheels and pulleys behind that actually make all of that work. So then there's, I think, one of the, another principle is legitimacy, that you're not alone. That whole thing, if you're going through a bad time with your mental health, is I'm the only one that's experiencing this. So there's a lot that we use to show people through, for example, these personalization engines and connecting them with others with similar issues, that they're not alone, what they bring is legitimate. Another principle is one of accompaniment, that you're not alone on your journey ever. So whether you're accompanied by a peer group, by a learning program you're on, by doing on a regular basis a condition tracking, that you are accompanied in your process of support and recovery. And I guess then, finally, I mean, there are others, but let me just pick one other, which is very profound for me, which I think is an age-old psychological principle, which is one of attachment. So constantly we're using technology to create attachment between people, often who's in offline lives where attachment has broken down in very many significant ways, to encourage them. For example, we know that 3% of our membership used 55% of the clinical wall guide time. Now, that tends to reflect the kind of heavy footfall figures of regular medicine, I'm told. So when we can spot the pattern of one of those 3%, we can technologically move them more towards the community and gradually encourage them to build the kinds of attachments that they're possibly struggling with and which may lie as part of the issues that they're facing with their mental health. So I'll stop there for a minute.
That's great. Jocelyn?
Yes, well, of course, our technology is an immersive type technology. So, well, it's a virtual reality type technology. So there is that experiential element that's there from the start. And if you think about, enhancing brain function, often you think about, I mean, we saw some nice examples this morning about games and stuff. It's either games or something relatively boring, so like, repeating certain tasks over and over again, so you don't get that feel. But we did do some gamification initially. We developed some interactions where we have, especially with the teams, one of the first things we did was build a collaborative versus competitive condition, because they're extremely competitive, you can imagine that. I mean, one of the issues we had was we weren't, allowed to discuss the results and everything else. The first thing the guys did when they came out of the room, I got the score, what did you get? Right. That's the first thing. So we're sitting there and going, oh, okay, no control over this. So it's in their nature, but it's in everybody's nature in some way, shape, or form. I think the way to sort of, one of the things that's really nice about, I think, this dynamic approach of using a NeuroTracker is the fact that you see results right away. It's very short, and it's a very brief exercise, about 5-6 minutes, and that was critical too. So how to sort of pack it into short bursts and still get some tangible results, and over relatively short periods. So if you think about most of the stuff that's been, the research that we've published, was done with a total training of about 90 minutes. It's just dispersed training. And we show that if you do a compacted training, it just doesn't work. So this little dispersive thing, you don't get the, often when you have to rotely go over and over and over and over again, there's some benefit to that in certain circumstances, but doesn't necessarily, the benefit doesn't necessarily equate the amount of time you're putting in. So that's one thing. So clearly you see these graphics coming up. It's instant. You can see your progress or degress. Right. If you had a night that's a little too, arrosé, as we say in French, the night before, it will show up on your results. So this is kind of nice, so you can actually see whether, this corresponds or not with your behavior. So these kinds of things, I think, are incentive. When it comes to children, that's for, adults, us adults. But for kids, it's one of the amazing things, like, it wasn't the original plan. We're sort of addressing issues like autism and things like that, but I've done a lot of work in that area. And so I didn't know if there would be plastic to this kind of thing, but actually they are quite a lot. And in fact, one of the things that's hard for some of these populations is engagement. It's one of the difficult things. They can't attend for very long at certain things. And we sort of participated and showed it to some of these children, and in fact, some of them, we couldn't take them out. So it's one of those things. So it'll vary with who we're dealing with and so on, but I think the fact of getting immediate feedback, accessibility, and now, many different platforms is the way we've been working on.
Right, so you sell NeuroTracker into multiple different verticals. You've got an education focus, you've got a high performance focus that the Navy SEALs use. Exactly. You've got other verticals. Do you customize those versions?
Yeah, that's the interesting part. So what we do is, really the basic exercise is always the same, and that's really the scalability issue. And it has to be that way. Otherwise, I think that was the idea originally, not to develop a game for each specific or an approach for each specific task. but it's built in such a way that somebody can construct their own, their own interests. It can build on top of it, the scalability of multitasking. So we have one approach that we call tactical awareness. And this was really at the demand of the special forces here in the US, that we did a lot of that, where the basic technology, so you have the basic exercise, and you can layer on top specific, their content-specific issues, whether it be, recognizing particular elements of danger or security, or whether it be making a rapid decision about, somebody's facial expression, and these are all important in the context of action. And so we overlay these elements, and what you see is the results from the NeuroTracker actually are sort of give you a gauge of how much engagement that specific task is requiring. And now it's actually being used as like a level of how much effort is required for your expertise level. So see, totally different twist that we hadn't predicted initially. So that way it's customized. If we can give you an open platform where people can add these elements, especially when we're dealing with special forces where some of those are closed systems, so we don't know what they're doing. So we give them the right tools so that we show examples, and then they actually go ahead and they build their own. So we don't know exactly what they're doing with some of these things, So, but we gave them that's how we made it different and adaptable for the different contexts.
Great. Yeah,
and for children, just one last thing, we had to adapt even the specific approach, because the way it works is you have to sort of track a certain number of elements dynamically. Now, obviously, if you're early in the development, or if you have severe brain damage or something, if you've had a severe impact on brain, you're not at that level. You've had stroke or something. So we have a quick ramping up process now where you start with different levels of targets just to get you at a level where it's workable. So that way it's been adapted too for kindergarten and other populations.
Well, that's terrific.
Yeah.
So, you each have different organizations. They sort of emerged in, their own unique histories. Why don't we talk about those organizations a little bit? Give the audience a flavor for, how many people you have working on these projects, how much funding you've had to date, how is the organization led? Where do you see it sort of going in the next couple of years? Jen, maybe we start with you.
Sure. So it started in 2007 in the UK, generated first revenues 2 years later, with main markets are in the UK on national health service payers and providers, military, universities, colleges, and employers, and private health insurers. We then started in the US about 18 months ago, where we have mainly customers like Baylor Scott White, Kaiser Permanente, Catholic Health Initiatives, and the very wonderful Mosaic, who are in the room here somewhere, who is our friends there, who are one of the very earliest believers in the concept. We employ about 80 people worldwide. We also have we were also the first sort of international proving out of the model after the UK was in Australia, in New Zealand. The company's now re-headquartered to New York because of 3 reasons. The kind of level of investment is much easier and better in the US context. Frankly, digital innovation is more cutting edge, and the market is larger. So we're now New York headquartered. We took in around $7 million last year, and we are now in the midst of another round.
So $7 million in private venture financing, or
in private individual financing and an impact UK fund, but yeah.
That's great, and you continue to generate revenue to support your services.
Absolutely, and we're now, we've been revenue generating since in the UK. We became profit making within 4 years. So the sort of major investment need is for building out the infrastructure here in the US. And
you moved from the UK to New York personally and have been traveling around the US?
Well, my family think I have, but not not in actuality. I tell you, it's cost me a fortune in presents for the kids.
Corey, tell us a little bit about Pear.
Sure. So I guess by way of an origin story, my co-founders and I were originally pulling together an e-health focused fund. We were looking for companies who were taking the regulatory high road and really trying to develop these digital therapies with what we call capital D data. And we weren't seeing those companies. And so instead of launching the fund, we wound up putting together the company in 2012. We are very roughly structured about 50-50 between Boston and San Francisco. Again, as I mentioned, that's a very deliberate decision on our part. All of our regulatory and clinical people are in Boston, and these are people who traditionally develop drugs and medical devices. And then all of our content creators, engineers, and product team are out in San Francisco. And these are the types of people who would otherwise be developing engaging digital content, but just for other reasons. I think in the last set of questions, I loved your use of the term digital stuff, because I think it really nicely speaks to what it takes to execute on an interface opportunity and just the type of cognitive dissonance that exists, at least in Pear, every day. So, I think the lesson for us is, when it comes to engagement, the best way to solve that problem is to hire people that have solved it in 3 other contexts. And by way of a very simple anecdote, we've got a prize wheel in one of our pieces of content, and our engineering and product team kept telling us how much they hate the prize wheel. I said, guys, I think this prize wheel is absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with this prize wheel. They throw an entire body of literature on my desk, and when I say throw it on my desk, they emailed me a bunch of PDFs about the optimization of prize wheels. It turns out one of our senior producers ran an online gambling company before Pear and thought for the last 36 months about how to build the perfect prize wheel. So, I think it just very nicely speaks to why this is hard, but also why this is really exciting. I think just to give the last requisite piece of company info, we're venture-backed, took down a venture round in, I want to say 2014. Like all good sharks, we die if we stop swimming, and so we're out raising another round. Like all medical product companies, we shun revenue, and so we're out fishing for the big one post-approval.
That's great. So there you have it, folks. Online gambling being used to treat addiction. It's great. Yeah. It's great. I love it. It's a good story.
It's a great story.
And Jocelyn, you at Cognizant, you guys have up to 20 people now?
Yeah, so close to 20, and we're a little spread out because we went where the customers were, Obviously, most of our market is in the US. So we have senior officers here working from Boston area and Baltimore area and so on. But we're based in Montreal. This is where my lab is, so we have to be close to the lab and where this really reasonable and accessible R&D money is, lab funding. But we've been quite active in Europe with obviously some of the teams and special operations, with, for instance, Formula One, the Red Bull team and so on. So we're pretty active that way. So just to go through the history, like everybody else, 2009 was really when I co-founded this with a real business person, because I'm not. I don't pretend to be. I'm the science behind it, and I'm the science, hopefully, that will keep getting, to run it, but I'm not really the business person. So from there, we again we were to work with some populations, but then clearly got into the performance perspective. And so, anything else you want to know about the company?
No, that's great. But you're looking at raising some money as well in the near term.
Thank you for that, Jack. That's very good, Jack.
Access to big
nice priming. Yeah, it's very, very good. So in regards to funding, yes, I forgot that part. We have well, in fact, most of the funding we have is we raised up to 15 million now, and that's been mostly private funding. So, private individuals who were funding the company, so that was close to the 8 million. We just closed the deal, and there was a reason for that. I don't want to go too long into that because my VC friends here, I don't want to offend my VC friends. But VC has, there's a special approach to it. It didn't quite fit the bill for us, at least initially, didn't quite fit the bill. Because they wanted, VCs normally want a specific market and a specific clientele, to make sure that's a guarantee. We invest our money, we want that. And we were more broadly dispersed in regards to the demands, and we thought the technology could be applied to more verticals. So we were going to validate with the real value on the field, validate to the real value, and changing experiences that are relevant to the people who want to do the exercise, not just what we think is good for them.
Right.
So change what they want to change to show the relevance of the exercise and the training. So that was it. So now we're ready I think we're ready for maybe 5 million or so we're looking for. Okay. A lot of it has to do with the other products that we sort of follow through and the marketing and everything else that is required to run a company.
Well, I have so many more questions for this group of wonderful entrepreneurs. Pricing, regulation, traction, science, but we'll just have to wait for after this panel because time is upon us. Totally. And I would just like to thank them so much for sharing their experiences with us.
Thank you.